All right, I am going to call the Neary Building Committee meeting to order for Monday, March 25th, 2024. It is 7:04 p.m. and we have 5 of our 7 voting members present, as well as a number of our ex officio members. First order of business is approval of outstanding minutes from March 4, 2024. I am going to hold off on this because I understand a few people had issues accessing the Google link. So if you did have access issues and you have not told me, you can just send me an email after this so I can link you up and make sure you have access prior to next week. And we'll vote on them next week if that's okay with everyone. And I wish I had a better way of doing it, but unfortunately, these documents are starting to get very large and we cannot attach them to emails anymore. They're bounce. With that, I will go into subcommittee reports. So Finance Subcommittee, anything to note, Kathy?
So not a lot to note. We spend most of the time approving the invoices for the previous month, which now, of course, are both Skanska and Arrow Street. So we spent through February 29th about $72K of the $950 that was allotted at the May 22 town meeting. The reimbursement requests have started going into the state. We've got a process to make sure that we track those reimbursements coming back between Carla and Becky. So I feel good about that. Just remind everyone though that we have spent, or we're planning to spend almost every penny of the $950. We've got $7,000 left over right now. So if anything else comes up, we'll probably have to figure out another way to fund that.
Any questions or comments for Kathy? All right. For Communications Subcommittee, we do have a posted meeting tomorrow where we do expect to talk about the website launch and the frequently asked questions, as well as the survey. Without going into details, I will denote that the survey response was a lot better than the last open meeting open forum we had. We did get 352 responses to the survey. So we will find a way to summarize that. A lot of good comments that will hopefully inform our frequently asked questions. So I expect the Communications Subcommittee to have a pretty robust update with some details next week. I also, under this bullet point, just wanted to congratulate all those involved with town meeting and getting through that process last weekend, but also would ask those that aren't familiar with the turnout or lack thereof to start to focus on that and think about how, we have a year until we're going to be bringing something forward to town meeting. So trying to, I know there's a lot of ideas and discussions going on in the community. I think this falls certainly within the purview of the Communications Subcommittee moving forward, but more broadly on our full committee, given the decision that we'll be in front of the town and making sure that everyone is A, informed, but B, present to make a decision. So a lot to discuss there going forward. And, I think we have a lot of work ahead of us to get the message out. But I would say I feel like the community has sufficiently woken up to the project at this point, based on the survey response coupled by the number of comments that I heard related to the project as rebuttal to certain articles that were at this year's town meeting that obviously had nothing to do with Neary, but just questioning, obviously, how much money does the town have, moving forward. Questions, comments, updates from the related communications. All right, with that, I'm going to start to bring the Arrow Street and Skanska folks in. I wanted to just provide, I guess, background for what we are and aren't going to do tonight. So there's going to be no committee discussion about any like progress updates, anything like that. We'll deal with all of that next week at our regularly scheduled meeting. Tonight's discussion is really going to be about building performance. It's mainly a presentation to us. Obviously, we can ask questions specifically related to the presentation. I do intend, especially if there are decisions that need to be made or feedback that we need to provide beyond, I think, some questions they may have for us at the end. we will have a follow-up agenda item on this next week. So this will not be the first and last time we discuss anything that's in this document. I also intend to, on next week's agenda, put a action item to form, like, i.e., create a charge and fill a sustainability subcommittee, and that comes at the recommendation of our OPM. So if, as you're listening to this discussion tonight, especially if you aren't on a subcommittee now and have interest, be ready to raise your hand next week. So just keep that all in the back of your mind as we listen to the discussion tonight, and we'll go from there. So with that, I don't know if I'm handing it directly to Kate or if Jim or Katie, you wanted to give any sort of opening.
I don't necessarily need to. Jim, I don't know if you had anything. I think with the amount of information that we have, I think you sort of touched on this, Jason, but Kate has quite a bit to cover tonight. So Kate, do you want questions as we go, or would you prefer people hold them to the end, or how do you want to
I think, if you have a pressing question, because there's kind of different sections, and what I usually try to do is stop before I go to the next section to see if there's any questions. So I will ask at those points, so you don't have to wait till the end. But if you had something really pressing, like you just didn't understand something I said, or I try to explain acronyms, but if I used an acronym and you weren't sure, you can jump in with that question. But I will ask question a couple points.
Okay, and who needs screen share privileges?
If you can do that for me, that would be great.
Okay, great. That is done. And Roger, before I turn it to Kate, I see your hand is up. So
Yeah, just quickly, Andrew's going to sign on in a minute or so, so he'll be in the waiting room at some point soon.
Okay, he might come right in if he uses the link, but I will watch either way. So Kate, the floor is yours, and go from there.
Great. I'm sharing, so let me know if you can't see it. Otherwise, I'm going to assume you can see my screen.
We can see it.
Great. So today we're going to go through just sort of a high level building performance discussion, and really just kind of give you some background of what it means when we talk about building performance, what types of things might we think about, getting you kind of thinking about this particular project and what sort of matters to you, what kind of is coming to the forefront for you when you think about this project. So we're going to start with a little bit of an overview. What is building performance? We'll talk about benchmarking and certifications. What are some ways that we measure how you're doing in terms of different components of building performance? We'll talk about requirements. So there's MSBA requirements, there's energy code requirements. And then we'll have the second half of this, we'll really talk about design strategies. What does it mean in a building, in a school building? What type of strategies might meet different types of goals that you would have? And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps and kind of going through the next few phases of the project and what will happen in each one. So starting right up front, what is building performance? Building performance is really sustainability, wellness, and resilience. We think about these three sort of very large, broad areas in terms of sustainability is focused on materials reduction, energy reduction, water reduction. So it's really thinking about those resources. It also is in there looking at site and transportation, and again, eliminating and reducing resources. That is what we think about when we talk about sustainability. Wellness is everything that impacts the human health impact of a project on site. We're talking about, really on site, in the building. That means things like indoor air quality, acoustics, having access to daylight and views to the outside. It's things like having a secure and safe environment. And even more specifically in schools, it's about how are you supporting the development of a child, especially at their younger years, and when that's a really big piece for them, both social and emotionally. So all of those kind of pieces of wellness, and it's inside the building and outside, right? So it's the site and your, the way that you're using the site and sort of the interplay between the site and the surroundings and the landscape and the building itself. And then resilience is really how is the building going to respond to events? So that could be things like a power outage. It could be, a snowstorm. It could be a hurricane in our area that happens. It could be flooding. And this is both today and in the future. So what is the future climate going to look like? Is there going to be increased temperatures? How would the buildings systems and HVAC system respond to that sort of future impact of climate? And we also want to make sure that when we're talking about these areas, we're also thinking about equity, diversity, inclusion, making sure that the solutions really represent and apply to all of the occupants of the building. What are the benefits of high performing schools? Obviously, building performance, sustainability, wellness, resilience makes you think about the environment. And this is really great for the local environment and the broader environment, but it also is something that needs to be able to support what you want to do with this building. What does it mean to have this building? What does it mean in terms of what happens in there every day? And how can we make connections between building performance and the way that you need the building to perform for you? And that's everything sort of on the left side of this graph, or those cost components of operating the building, making sure it's operable in terms of a financial aspect, but also all the other components of what do you want to do with the occupants of the building? How can you support them? How can you support their health? How does that then translate to improved cognition, less absenteeism, being able to attract and retain staff, and being able to use the building to support your educational needs? What are components of this building could support curriculum or things that you're trying to talk about in the building? And we break those sort of 3 large buckets into what we call the 10 measures. And this is a way for us to kind of delve down a little deeper into very specific topics that are covered in the sustainability, wellness, and resilience sphere, if you will. And so the 10 measures you can see on the screen, we'll go through, click to the next slide. So we start with integration. Integration is really kind of what we're doing today, why we're talking about this, at the very beginning of the project, and we'll continue to talk about it throughout the whole project and into operation of the building. And so integration is really important. We use what's called an integrated process, which means us here today talking with all of you, learning about what your needs and goals and desires are for the building. It means working with the consultants, like the engineers. It means working with the contractor once they come on board, all of the different parties being at the table at all the points of the project, so we can make sure that everyone is really coordinated and integrated together. Integration also means, what is the main concept of the building? What are the main goals that will come out of really the phase we're in today, and making sure that that building gives you what we call beauty and delight. And that's sort of really intangibles, right? Like, how does this building support what you're doing, and making sure that this building has those basic needs of supporting your mission and also creating enjoyment by being in the space. Equitable community is a little more tangible. It's, what are we doing with this building to help support and engage your community? And that's obviously different for every community. And so we'll figure out, what does that mean for you, and how can we make the building support that? It's also very specific things, like if alternative transportation is really important, so you making sure people can walk or bike to the site, and thinking about universal design. Universal design is not just looking at accessibility and making sure the building meets all the accessibility codes, but also how is it really inclusive for all the different learners at different levels throughout the building and space. Ecology is thinking about really the site and the environment that it's in, the building where it sits. So thinking about the plants and the, are these pollinators? Are these native plants? Are we helping to support biodiversity? Are we maintaining existing biodiversity from any implementations of new construction? We think about light pollution, site acoustics. Are the, if there's rooftop air handling units, are we making sure that those don't create acoustic nuisances? Water, pretty straightforward. This is really about reducing the amount of water that's used. Schools use very little water in terms of like what we call potable or drinking water. Most of it's for toilet flushings in schools. That's a lot of the water goes to that. And so how can you reduce using potable water for things like that where you don't need it. This also will be stormwater, thinking about stormwater management on the site and reducing that and increasing infiltration into the ground. Economy is thinking about what is everything that we're doing and how does it impact costs. So things like, going through the program, which is again, like a big piece of this this phase, or what's the right size, what's the right type of spaces that you need, not oversizing or having too much. That really rarely happens in schools, right? You build the number of classrooms that that you need, but also thinking about life cycle cost. So looking at what does it cost to construct, but also operate and maintain different systems. That's really important. And of course, talking about any incentives that are available for different solutions you might be incorporating. Energy is really energy and carbon. It's reducing the amount of energy that's needed, making sure that also then translates into reduction in carbon. We'll get into energy a little bit more later. Wellness, we talked about this a little bit already. It's the indoor environment. It's everything that you experience being in the building, from the air quality to the lighting. It's also, being able to support active design, making sure it's encouraging, people to move through the building. This isn't as difficult in schools, but you can imagine an office building, it's really important to make sure people take the stairs and encouraging them to do that. In schools, it's commonplace people take the stairs. Resources is really focused on materials. And so that is looking at the carbon that goes into producing and constructing with materials. It also talks about operations and waste and, reducing waste, increasing recycling and composting. So it's kind of the design, construction, and the operation side of waste and resources. Change is really thinking about resilience, which we talked about a little bit already, but also adaptability. And that could be programmatic adaptability, multi-purpose uses for spaces. And the last bullet under there, passive survivability, isn't as big of a concern with schools, but that's, how is the building able to maintain its temperature if, say, the power went out, right? So if it has a great envelope, you'd be able to maintain the heat in a building longer before it would start to get cold in there. That is what passive survivability is. And on discovery, that's kind of two pieces. One is the operations side, being able to know where energy is going through metering, to be able to adjust and make sure that you're always operating where you want to be. But it's also thinking about the building as a teaching tool and which components the building can support your curriculum, whether it's indirectly through just providing spaces for things to happen, or directly like, using a dashboard where you see how much energy is used in a space and do problem solving around that. Any questions on those measures? We're going to do a little exercise at the end of this today to kind of talk about these a little bit more. And I'm just, touching the tip of the iceberg. I would say these are just some bullets to get you to understand kind of what's in these 10 measures. There's lots of other components that we'll think about in these measures.
I'm seeing no hands up, so keep going.
Great. So how do we know how we're doing in those measures? How do you know if, doing 10 things over here in this bucket and one thing's over here in another bucket, like, is that good? How do you know, like, what's the right level of what you should be thinking about? And so there's building rating systems. You probably all have at least heard of LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's been around for 30 years almost. And so I will say that all rating systems are aspirational. It's a level that you should aspire to. And, it's code is sort of like the minimum, code's the baseline, right? You have to do that. But what would you aspire to do if you wanted to, achieve a greater level of benchmarking? And so this slide is just showing all the different ones that exist out there. At the top, there's holistic rating systems, meaning they cover all those buckets. They cover all those 10 measures in some way. Then there's wellness focus, really take a deep dive thinking about human occupant wellness. And then there's other rating systems that are focused on energy or carbon at the bottom there. For most school projects, they're looking at LEED as really a holistic benchmark. Maybe thinking about something around carbon and energy, if that's something that's really interesting to a project. And some schools have done a wellness focused rating system. But again, the holistic building systems are holistic. They have wellness, they have carbon and energy that are part of them. And so it's not super common to see a lot of these certifications, but I also like to just point those out so people understand kind of what's out there. This chart is really just explaining that in a little bit more detail of, are they all equal? The holistic ones, are they all equal in sustainability, wellness, resilience, and equity? And the answer is no, but I would say, again, these are all aspirational. These all have great levels of all of these components. And some of them, kind of go, we'll call them the sort of cutting edge, right? Some of them are like the most stringent and some of them are a little less stringent, but they're all, again, aspirational and doing great things across all these categories. And so you can see in the middle here, LEED or New England CHIPS is a equivalent to that that we use here in Massachusetts. You can see that right in the middle. And there is an MSBA requirement for the project to achieve either LEED or New England CHIPS certification. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And there is an energy code pathway. There's 2 pathways, and one of them is to do a passive house certification. And so that's that energy focused certification that does have some indoor air quality. That's what IIQ stands for, and water components, but it's mainly focused on energy and carbon. So getting into those MSBA requirements for this project, which is required for all of the core program projects through the MSBA. On the left, you'll see the base requirement. And so the base requirement is the stretch energy code. Your community is a stretch code community, so you're already doing that. If you weren't, you would be required to do that, but you are already a stretch community, and you either have to do LEED or CHIPS certification, as I mentioned. There are some minimum requirements in there. You have to achieve a LEED silver level. If you're not familiar with LEED, it goes from certified silver, gold, and platinum. There's 4 levels to that certification. So you have to achieve silver, which is very achievable. And then on the CHIP side, they have 2 levels. They have what's called verified or verified leader, and you have to be at the verified level. There are also some minimum requirements for indoor air quality. So there's credits within those rating systems for indoor air quality, and you do have to achieve a minimum amount of indoor air quality. This was a change more recently with MSBA because they saw that this was easily achievable. Every project was essentially achieving those amount of indoor air quality points or more. So they made that the benchmark. For an additional reimbursement, you can do everything that's required, plus you can pursue more indoor air quality points, either LEED or CHIPS. And again, these are just equivalents of each other. And so by doing more indoor air quality points, you can receive an additional 1%. And there's another option. These are not, you don't have to take them together. You could take either one, or you can take them together. There's another option to do the specialized energy code for an additional 3%. So again, base requirement plus specialized code on top of the stretch energy code. So you can achieve up to a 4% additional reimbursement from MSBA. And so I'm just going to talk about LEED and CHIPS a little bit. We're not asking for this tonight, but it's something in the fairly near future. We would like to know which certification so that we can start planning for that certification. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the differences between LEED and CHIPS. They essentially they're not different. They're just 2 different certification entities. They have different credits. They're called different things, but essentially they're equivalent. And that's why you're allowed to do either one. And as I mentioned before, LEED has 4 levels of certification. Many schools achieve either gold or platinum, but those silver is the minimum requirement, and CHIPS has 2. Most projects achieve the verified level of that. They're just, because there's only 2 levels, it's a really wide range of points that ends up falling in one level. So CHIPS does have specific credits for district plans and district operation policies. LEED doesn't explicitly have those, but you can also get innovation credits in LEED, and you could use some of those policies for innovation credits. CHIPS does have a bit higher fees, and you could actually see that on the previous slide in this sort of blue color at the bottom. It just shows you what the certification fees are, and CHIPS does have a more of a range of, and that's based on whether you're doing an addition renovation or a new construction. It has different levels, so a little bit more. LEED 0, which you may have recalled was on the previous slide here, which is a certification related to energy and carbon. If you were to be a net zero building and want to achieve that as a certified net zero building, there's something called LEED 0 that basically you just prove that you are operating at a net zero, and you can get that certification. If you are interested in that, it is a requirement to have had LEED certification and then go to LEED 0 later on. So that's something to think about. And then we will say that the CHIPS reviews do take longer, which sometimes can be a bit of an issue when you're trying to close out the project at the end. It's just a smaller organization, and so they don't have as many tools and reviewers and things like that as LEED does, and so it can take longer to do that. Any questions before I go into energy code? So you may be aware that in 2023, July 1st, 2023, so almost a year ago, the stretch code updated in Massachusetts. And so some major component updates to the stretch code was really a focus on looking at what we call heating and cooling demand reductions, or basically reducing the loads through the envelope and through the ventilation to reduce the amount of heating and cooling that is required for buildings. And these are really what we call passive design strategies. You think of it as passive because the envelope, it's airtight, has high thermal performance, and that means that you don't have as much solar gain or losses. And so that's a passive strategy. And that's balanced, that's incorporated with what we call balanced ventilation, which is basically supplying all the ventilation air that you need and recovering any energy on that and ventilation air as you send it back out of the building. And so these passive building strategies are basically what you find in a passive house certification. As you can imagine, that's where the passive house part of that certification comes from. And so with the new energy code, there's really 2 pathways for schools to comply with the code. There's doing a passive house certification through a third party, so similar to LEED, which is a certification with a third party that reviews and says, yep, you have this certification, you get your plaque, your certificate. There's 2 bodies that do passive house certification. And if you choose not to do the passive house certification, there is a pathway that doesn't require that third party review. And so the state in the new energy code has basically created a modeling and prescriptive requirements that is a pathway that is essentially equivalent to passive house, but it is different. It's a different modeling, it's different software. The prescriptive requirements are a little bit different. And so there's some nuances to doing that, but there's 2 options that essentially are trying to get you to the same result, which is, a low heating and cooling demand building. This specialized opt-in code is that you pick your path, your passive house certification, or your TEDI, we call it TEDI, because it stands for thermal energy demand intensity. You pick that, that stays all the same. You do all of the stretch code pieces, and then there's this layer that goes on top. And you have options with that layer on top. You can do what's called a zero energy pathway on top, which is that you can get all of your energy that you need for the building on site through renewable energy, which is typically solar PV panels. And if you don't have any, sorry, if you do have some components to your building that aren't day one electric systems, if you had a natural gas system for something like domestic hot water, you have to prepare and pre-wire and pre-design the building to be electrified in the future. The second option is to be all electric. So if all of your systems, this includes all your regular operation systems. So your heating, your cooling, your domestic hot water, if that is all electric, then you would meet that path. It does not include emergency generation. So if you have an emergency generator, you can still have a fossil fuel emergency generator. And then the third option is called mixed fuel. And mixed fuel is does allow you to have both electric and natural gas systems, but it does increase the requirements on your efficiency of any of those systems. And then you have to maximize your on-site solar to the whatever extent feasible, and then do pre-wiring for electrification if you, for whatever components weren't electrified day one. I would say that most projects for the specialized code do go through the all-electric pathway. That is most of the things that you'll be doing to meet the stretch code component of this lends you to already being an all-electric building. And so the specialized code is really not really adding any layer on top of it, but you can meet that all-electric path without any additional design strategies. And again, I'm not asking for a clarification of which pathway. I'm just kind of giving you the information today. But we will be working through this phase on doing code compliance to one of those pathways. So what is the difference? Because these two pathways in the code are really trying to be equivalent, but they are different in the fact that they're different modeling systems. There's a few differences between the two. Most of the components of the building will be the same, and in pink you'll see some differences. So the TEDI path, and again, this is very new. This has been something that's been less than a year, and so Aristry and other architecture firms have been working on this and really sharing information that we're learning as we go through this new modeling software or modeling program that is just new to the industry. And so what we're seeing is that it may require higher thermal assemblies. That means, more insulation than you might have through the passive house path. So that's something to think about. The passive house is a third-party process, so there's a certification fee for that. Although there is an incentive if you also do path one of the Mass Save incentive, there is an incentive to cover that cost. But there are, fees there. And then on the construction side, the whole new 2023 update to the stretch code does have more testing and verification in construction, such as air leakage testing, MEP commissioning, which is already common for school projects. And then the other component is Passive House does have some more additional testing and verification, and that's really both observations as well as actual testing to make sure that the building is being built to the design intent.
Kate, I'm going to pause you there. Roger has his hand up.
Yep.
Thanks, Jason. So I just have a question, on certification, and this is really a curiosity question, as opposed to a question whose answer I think would necessarily play a role in our decision. But does either LEED or CHIPS, as far as school buildings are concerned, do you find that one or the other enjoy a kind of predominance of choice? And again, this is really a curiosity question. I'm not suggesting that the answer to this, if there is something clear cut, should necessarily play a role in what we decide?
So I haven't checked it probably in about a year, but about 90% of the projects that go through the MSBA choose LEED as their certification.
Okay, thank you.
So any questions about what we covered so far before we go into, design strategies and, what all this kind of plays out in the building?
Seeing none at this point.
So I'm going to walk through, typical design strategies that you'll see in public schools throughout Massachusetts, both current schools and really for the last 5 to 10 years, focusing on the healthy indoor environment first. We talked about this a little bit already, but what does this actually look like? Like, what are some of the strategies to support wellness that you'll see throughout the different spaces? It's things like ergonomic furniture. And again, every school is a little bit different, really, in every grade level, and sometimes every classroom is a little bit different of, what does that mean? What kind of furniture helps support the learners? Because it kind of changes sometimes throughout different grade levels. Acoustics, making sure that there's acoustics and acoustic separation between classrooms and hallways, making sure we're isolating sound and providing acoustic treatments. Some of it, like in a classroom, you don't notice it as much, although the ceiling is a big component of it. And then in large spaces like cafeterias or gyms, it's more obvious. You'll see acoustic panels and things like that. Making sure that the lighting is appropriate, and so that the lighting is dimmable, and it also has indirect lighting is when light fixture shines from a fixture up towards the ceiling and illuminates the ceiling, and that is called indirect. So you want to make sure you have that. Really makes the space feel illuminated without having a lot of direct downlight and glare that you can sometimes get with that. So balancing that, having dimmable fixtures, having fixtures that can switch off for different things, having a fixture at the teaching wall maybe, or things like that, that is separate controls from other areas. Operable windows, daylight and views, making sure you're balancing the amount of that daylight. So you have daylight, but you limit and reduce glare. Natural look materials, so that is something we called biophilia. It's bringing nature into spaces, so that can be you can see here where there's wood look material on the floor. It can be using natural colors. It can be, actual natural materials like wood or stone or things like that, but also being able to see nature outside. Displacement ventilation is something that the majority of our schools use. That is providing ventilation down low into the space where the occupied space is, where the breathing zone is, and that air can come in at a lower velocity. So it's not trying to push air from a ceiling level down to where you are, because that sometimes can cause thermal discomfort, but you need to have it come out higher velocity to get to where you're breathing. And also there's some acoustics components with displacement, because it's coming in lower to the space. It's not as loud. And so there's an acoustic component to it. And then it has great indoor air quality, which any of the systems that we would put into a building or consider whether it is displacement or not will have great indoor air quality with filtration, at the air handlers, and making sure that that is a piece of it. And then healthy materials is really important, and this is something that some people might not have been familiar with this, and how materials can impact the air quality of the space and the health of people who are coming in contact with materials. But building materials, as well as furnishings, as well as markers and all kinds of materials, can have materials that have higher levels of toxicity as part of them. And so we really go through a rigorous process to make sure that all the materials we're putting into the space are free of what we call chemicals of concern. And so those are things like PFAS, flame retardants, antimicrobials, phthalates. We want to make sure that the finishes, the things you come in contact with, like the paint and the flooring, the furniture, ceiling materials, as well as a lot of the components that go inside walls and in the exterior of the building that you don't necessarily see as well, And that's a big piece of it. What's the material that goes into building products? Also making sure that they don't off gas. That's the low emitting component of this. So making sure the material isn't in there, but also that there is no off gassing happening in this space. And we typically do a flush out. A flush out means running the HVAC system, running the ventilation system before the building is occupied, to the extent that we can with a construction schedule, and also continuing that during the occupancy phase as well sometimes. Or we can also test the air quality. And so that's just making sure that, once construction's done, before it's occupied, we make sure that there's great air quality. Kind of switching gears, the other big design strategy is around carbon. And there's several different components that are contributing to carbon in a building. And so embodied carbon is where we start. Embodied carbon is all of the carbon that is associated with producing the materials, producing the brick and the carpet and the ceiling tile and the paint, transporting it to the site and building the building. All that is what we call embodied carbon. And it's there day one. So all that carbon is there when a project is done and it opens. And there's also points where you'll add embodied carbon. We know whenever you need to replace a material or replace a system, or at the end of life of a piece of equipment, that's also part of the embodied carbon. Operational carbon is what you can think of as the energy use of your building. The heating, cooling, ventilation, plug loads. Plug loads is anything you plug in, like your computers and your security system, all of that energy that it takes to run the building during operations. That's what we call operational carbon. Transportation carbon is what it sounds like. It's carbon that's coming from getting to your building. So whether it's school buses or cars, it's that component. And then water carbon is the carbon that's associated with producing potable water and transporting it to your building, because there is a lot of energy that goes into processing water and getting it to potable levels and providing it to buildings. And then waste carbon, again, is something that's both on the construction side, and we'll call that sort of the construction design side, and the operational side. So it's all of the pieces that you use to build a building, and are they made of recycled content? Can they be recycled at the end of their life? If you're demolishing any components of a building, where's that demo going? Is that going to a landfill, or are we diverting it from landfills? And then on the operation side, it's making sure that whatever you're going to do with your resources, whether it's compost, recycling, or landfill, that the building can support those processes to happen during the operation side. And really what we want to do is reduce carbon through all of these sources of carbon throughout the building, to the extent that you want to set goals on. And then once you reduce carbon, you also want to make sure that where you can, you're providing energy for some of these, because they're not all going to be at zero. You still need to use energy. You still need to make building materials. And so looking at renewable energy to offset any of the components of the project and the materials with the project. So some of the design strategies that we think about on the embodied carbon side is, we really start with optimizing the structure and the massing of a building. So that's being just efficient with the structure, making sure that bays, again, are really just right sized and they make sense. A lot of this is sort of common sense, because you want to make sure you also are reducing costs. You don't want to have like 20 tons of steel when 10 tons of steel will do, right? So a lot of the strategies for embodied carbon are really also about just reducing costs and being efficient in the design. It's also using less materials. So an example of using less material would be instead of painting a wall and then putting up a wood panel and then putting up an acoustic panel on top of that wood panel and just having a lot of materials and like really complex systems, having simpler systems, less materials. It's not really an aesthetic thing. It's really about how much material, how can we be efficient with that? And that obviously also ties into cost. And then once you sort of optimize, you really are thinking about the specific material that you're picking and using lower carbon materials. Lots of carbon in a building, the majority of the carbon is in part of the concrete or the steel, but there are other high carbon components to buildings like the insulation and glass and glazing systems. Those are also potentially higher carbon components of a building. And so we think about how do we select low carbon materials. And then making sure that materials are long lasting, that they're durable, that they're repairable, because again, embodied carbon comes back to play when you have to replace materials over time. And so the longer things last and the less frequently you have to replace them, that helps with embodied carbon. And then you can potentially sequester or have carbon offsets to cover the embodied carbon that is remaining, because there will be a carbon footprint. We haven't figured out how to make buildings out of air yet. On the operational carbon side, as I mentioned earlier, operational carbon, think about that as that's your energy of your building, the common understanding of energy to run your building, heat it, cool it, turn the lights on, plug things in. And so net zero energy is really the strategy that is used for reducing operational carbon. Net zero energy is really an equation. The left-hand side of the equation is energy use. And so you start by trying to reduce the amount of energy, have the most efficient systems, have passive systems, like we were talking about earlier, where if you have a great envelope, that means you need less energy to heat or cool it. And so you reduce your energy, and then with the energy that you do need to use in a building, you offset it with renewable energy production. And so that could be on-site, having solar panels on your roof or on your site, but it also can be purchasing what we call renewable energy credits, which is off-site renewable energy. And so that is what a net zero energy is, and that net zero energy building is, and that's really the main strategy for operational carbon, is to strive towards net zero. In terms of how do you get there on the energy side, how you do reduce the energy, again, it really starts with what is the most impactful component. Similar to embodied carbon, is really about thinking about the design and the efficiency of the design, the massing of the building, the orientation, making sure that you have the glazing where you want it, and that it's north and south facing, because that you can control the amount of solar gain that you get from the sun into your building that way. And it's really what we call passive strategies. Second step is to think about your mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. What are the heating, the cooling system? Heat pumps are the main source of heating and cooling. And so there's lots of different types of heat pumps, and we won't go into those today, but that's the big piece of it, having an electrified heat pump system that makes sense for the building, and then thinking about other components like heat recovery, recovering any heat as you transfer air in and out for ventilation, LED lighting. Demand control is really adjusting the ventilation rate to meet the needs of the space. So when you have kids in a classroom for an hour, you need more ventilation because there's more bodies in there, more people breathing. And so increasing and decreasing the ventilation based on occupancy. And then once you have the building and the MEP system set, you want to make sure that there's an operations side where you're able to understand where energy is going and you can adjust for that. That's things like having metering, having a building automation system, which is a controls system. And also occupant training is really important, especially in schools. You will have some people who are coming back every year, like teachers or students, you'll have new students, you'll have new teachers, making sure everyone understands their role. Because again, those components that are occupied, controlled, like turning the light switch on and off, they need to know how they're using the building, how to use it, and then how does what they're doing impact the overall energy use of the building. And so occupant engagement is really important, not just in operations, but really throughout the whole project. Being able to plan the building, understand your spaces, program them the way that you need them to operate in the building. And as architects, we really need to be thinking about it from an energy perspective. So we think about, what components of the building aren't used at different times of the day or week or year, and how can we program the building to meet your needs, but also, okay, now how can we put the mechanical systems in that support the way the building is being used, so you can set back different components to the building and not use energy where you don't need it. And then once you have sort of this, again, you're lowering your energy use into a certain point, and then you're providing renewable energy for the load that you have remaining. Any questions on energy, on operational carbon, before I go into the last two topics?
Seeing none.
So water is another big component, but it is a big use in the building. But if you can look at this diagram, all those gray bottles, those rows of gray bottles, are all the water that the building uses that doesn't need to be potable. And essentially, as I mentioned earlier, that's flushing the toilet. The majority of use of water in a school is for flushing the toilet. And there are components where you need potable water, obviously for drinking, for cooking, and for kitchens, for other process loads where you need essentially faucet water. But we're spending all this energy to make potable water for what needs that don't need to be potable. And so wherever we can reduce that, that will help the water footprint of the building. And so it starts with conserving water. Low flow fixtures are very common. Everyone's been really seeing those in any new space for the last 15 to 20 years, but they still are really number one source to be able to reduce the amount of energy. So having low flow fixtures, also making sure if there's a leak, right? So leak detection is really important, so that if you have a leak, you can stop that leak. And so you're not losing water that you didn't know you were losing. Occupant engagement is important. Again, making sure people understand that their behavior impacts the building and how much it's using. Harvest and reuse is a strategy that we see. I would say it's common that it's not, it's been around for a while, but it's not something that is, in the majority of projects, there is a cost to being able to collect. Harvesting is really collecting rainwater and then reusing it. So you collect it and you can treat it to a certain level, and you can reuse it for things like toilet flushing. You can also use it for irrigation if that's a need. And then restoring, that's sort of the ultimate sort of completing the cycle. And that is, very less common, although we do have, Air has worked on one net zero water school where they, treated the water on site, what we call black water. But that is less common for public schools. And waste is the other big source of carbon. And so waste is about, conserving and reducing, right? Using less materials means there's potential for less waste at the end of the use of that material. Reusing and donating. Again, this really comes into play if we're talking about a project where you might be demolishing a building or a portion of a building. What can we do with that embodied carbon that is in that building? Can we reuse it for this project, for something else? Where can that go? And it's everything from the, bricks in the walls to furniture or equipment. And then on the operation side, that's where we really want to understand, like, what are you doing in your schools? What do you want to be able to do in your schools in terms of materials and resource management? Are you composting? Are you recycling? What are you composting? What are you recycling? What does that happen? How can the building and the space support the operation side? And that's it for me talking for a long time. I went over a lot of stuff. I'm happy to answer questions about anything. And then we're going to go into a little bit of a thought exercise.
So I'll open up to questions. All
And
right.
if you,
None at
if you
this
have no
time.
questions, that's fine too.
I'm sure they're coming, but maybe not tonight. All right. Why don't you keep going with your thought exercise then?
Yeah. So we're going to just do a brief exercise around the 10 measures. And so I put
I'm
them up
sorry.
here. Yep.
Greg was a little delayed with his hand, but before we go into it.
Slow to raise my hand, my virtual hand. So obviously each, whether it's LEED or the different classifications, is there a cost factor as well that we need to consider as we make decisions around efficiencies?
Yes. I would say that all of the components that we just talked about in this design strategy sections, healthy materials, other wellness components, the energy and operational carbon and the embodied carbon, and to some extent water and waste, those are all components of the holistic certification. So LEED or CHIPS, those are major components to each one of those rating systems. And so for the MSBA process, and just kind of being at the lower level of those rating systems, the silver or verified, you're going to be doing a lot of great work that has little to no cost to it. And that's because it's really industry standard. Once you start going beyond those base requirements, if you wanted to strive towards, say, LEED Gold or even LEED Platinum, you're potentially starting to do some things that might have a cost implication to them, with the caveat that the new energy code in Massachusetts is actually going to get you really far in either certification in the what we call the energy category. And both of those certifications, a lot of the weighting and points are in energy and carbon, and that's because that has much more broader impact on health and other components as well. And so that's why energy and carbon is a big focus. And so you'll be sort of already going towards that direction just for code. And that's why I will say, and again, we're not going to cover this in tonight's presentation, but when we start talking about HVAC systems and electrified systems and sort of net zero more, you'll see that those systems and the path to net zero, the energy load reduction side of it, is not going to cost you any more to do that, because that's just where the market is today in terms of the cost of systems and the incentives that come along with them, whether it's state or federal incentives. I will say on the water side, there is a cost there. There is a cost to harvest and reuse rainwater. The majority of our projects don't go that path. We do have, like I said, one project that went there, and really because on-site Blackwater treatment was something they were going to do anyways, and that was really a site-specific consideration. That is typically a cost that you're not going to sort of see because there's not a huge benefit. The cost of water isn't that high, and so there's no real return on investment for that.
Thank you.
Kathy, then Roger.
So I haven't raised my hand before now because this is rather overwhelming, but let me try to ask a simple question. If you separate the things you have to do to be LEED Silver, to be CHIPS Basic, to comply with the new energy code that we have to do, so put those aside. Then when you've got choices, like what you described with the water, et cetera, how are we going to make those choices? I know Jason said we're going to appoint a sustainability subcommittee next week, but this is all moving so fast. How are we going to make those choices, and how can we not make those choices if we don't have cost, including what points we might get from MSBA to do those things?
Yeah, so, and we'll talk about this, it'll be the last thing we do tonight, is we'll talk about the process. On the energy and carbon side, which has the potential to be where most of your cost is just on a building project, because HVAC systems are one of the largest costs of a project. We're going to do what's called a life cycle cost assessment. So we're going to talk further about what types of systems you're thinking about for the building. We'll talk about what types of systems will, be able to meet the code. And we'll study, 3 systems that are systems that you're thinking about for the building. We'll do an assessment to understand what the energy use of those systems are, what the operations impacts are, the maintenance impacts, both the physical maintenance as well as the cost of maintenance. And we'll do what's called a life cycle cost assessment to show you, what both the initial costs, but the long-term costs are for those systems. So we will do this assessment that will help you then at the end of that in schematic design be able to select a system to move forward with. And then in terms of some of the other pieces, most of them don't really have much cost implication. So if it's, picking this flooring versus that flooring, that's really a after SD consideration, because there's no big impact there. The other kind of larger component to think about is the water piece of it. And we typically don't do a water life cycle cost assessment, but we can at their request. If you're really interested in understanding what that would mean, if you feel like that's a goal that you really want to think about for this building, for your community, there is a comparative life cycle cost assessment you can do around water and rainwater reuse to help you make that decision. That's really where the bulk of cost is. And then this next phases through the end of schematic design is around the HVAC system selection, potentially a water reuse system. And then photovoltaics and PV is another piece that we can study, but there, that we can show you kind of what the impacts are to own that system or do PPA. I think I saw that potentially the town is thinking about a PPA. That I think that was a warrant article the other day to think about a PPA for a different school. And so that's something we will talk about as well and help you understand what that might be.
So one more follow-up question, Roger. So Kate, you read our warrant? Very good. That's pretty diligent. So I'm still confused. One of the things that I think most of us are going to use to try to determine which route we take, whether we close the school or whether we don't, in my mind, is the cost. And if what you just described doesn't happen until schematic, which is long after we've decided which route we're going, how do we understand then what the cost is going to be of the project we select if all this comes later?
So they'll be costing through all of the PDP and the PSR phases as well. I was just talking about the life cycle cost component that happens in schematic design, and that's just specifically to the HVAC system. But we will look at both the renovation, new construction, and whatever variation of options, those will be costed, and there'll be an appropriate system that is the same for each of those. So it's basically an equivalent system. So you're comparing apples to apples for the HVAC component in that pricing exercise.
Yeah, and if I can just jump, yeah. So the submission for May, we are setting up the options we're going to be exploring. The submission in August is what we will be when we are getting to the selected options. So we're going to have some time to cost these things out, define the goals as Kate was walking through. And we do estimates at each step of the way. When we get to the final project scope and budget, that's the number that the town will be voting on, that's when we have to have all those things defined and within the project budget to a finer detail. To Kate's point, obviously the selection of options, the cost is going to be a big piece of it. So we're just going to have to define, and that's part of this exercise tonight, define the goals, define the cost impacts of those goals, and make sure they're incorporated when we're making that determination between options.
Okay.
Roger?
Well, first I want to echo what Kathy said about being overwhelmed. I certainly am also. Kate, this could be for you maybe, or Jim. So in the school projects that Skanska is involved with, what percentage of those school projects, general, are MSBA projects that you work on versus schools that may not be MSBA? Half or 3/4 or 1/4? I mean, just looking for something in general here.
For Skanska, the majority of our projects are all MSBA.
They are, okay.
Unless it's higher ed, or another market sector. Yeah, it's primarily MSBA work.
Okay, so what about projects that aren't schools? What, and in other words, are most of your, you know, I should know more about the firm, but I don't, I'm sorry. Are you mostly schools at your firm, or are you 50% schools, or on buildings?
Yeah, if you're speaking to the OPM side of our business,
Yeah.
A bulk of our business is schools.
Okay, all right, then I think I'm sort of done, because there were a couple of different instances where when Kate said for our MSBA projects a couple of times, and so I was I took that as maybe being you know, something that would suggest that there also were a number of projects that weren't MSBA, and there might be different. You might see different directions, you know, in the energy and carbon and you know, water, you know, for buildings that aren't MSBA, but for different reasons. So I think I think my question's over. I don't think it ever got started. Thank you.
Yes, and I apologize. I work on lots of different types of projects. You know, schools are a big part of the portfolio that in projects that are ones that Air Street's working on, but I also work on labs and offices. So sometimes I'm just sort of bifurcating that when I'm talking, but yes, we work on a lot of schools and a lot of MSBA schools.
And I was gonna just jump in, Roger. It varies. We're under construction and I've done 2 projects with the city of Newton, which is outside of the MSBA process. But I would say they very much follow the MSBA model. We're just starting work on another project for another community that is not an MSBA project. And then we do charter schools, which are sort of a whole different level of discussion and are often looking for how can they produce the least expensive building upfront costs. And
Larry, those non-MSBA schools chose not to go the MSBA route?
For various reasons, yes.
All right, any other questions? All right, Kate, back to you.
Okay, so getting back to the 10 measures, and again, I know this is a lot of information, and some of you have not been through a building project before and been thinking about these things, so that's totally understandable. But we're going to try to do a little exercise here where each person, this is really individual. We're going to share if people want to share back to the larger group. But really take a couple of minutes and think about, you know, and this can change over time, right? So we're asking, you know, on this date today, you know, what kind of measures? And I say 2, people always ask, can I write 3 or 4? Yes, you can write more than 2. Don't write 10. Don't write all 10 of them. that you're kind of thinking that are kind of coming to the forefront for you for this particular project and why. And again, this is individual, but we'll also go ask you to share back. Not everyone needs to share, but if there's somebody who wants to share back, we'll do that. And so I'm going to go back to the measures just so you all have them in front of you. And this is something that we're doing tonight. And this is something we also often do in a community forum, in a larger forum, and getting community input as well. So this won't be the last time that I sort of see these and we talk about them and talk about what's coming to your mind. And Roger, do you have a question? I can't remember if your hand.
I do,
It's
I
just up
do. I
from
put
last
it
time.
back up, and I put it up when you said, you know, if you want to submit more than two, it's all right. I mean, doesn't that defeat the purpose a little bit of really having to kind of make some hard decisions here on the two things that are the most important? I mean, they're all, to some degree, you could argue that all of these are important, right? They're just maybe levels of importance. So
Right, yes.
aren't you really asking for the ones that at the moment, you know, the various parties here are having to make a decision on what are the two most important? Just asking the question.
Yeah, and that's why I said don't say 10. But if you feel like you really are strongly feeling that there's 3 items that are really coming to the forefront, that's fine to have 3. Because
Okay.
again, they're all important, but if you feel like something is not important, you're more than welcome to share that as well. Because all 10 of them will be met with the project in some way, shape, or form. But it's like, what are we really gonna focus on? You know, what's really important for you to see. So I'm gonna start my little timer.
I was going to ask if you need me to do a timer or if you were going to do it. So thank you.
Okay, 2 minutes. Okay. So if you're still working, that's fine, but that's 2 minutes. And so I am gonna have everyone give me their 2 or 3. You don't have to do anything more than say, you know, what those 2 or 3 are. But if you feel so inclined to talk about the why you picked them, you're more than welcome to share that as well. We don't have time for everyone to give their why, so hopefully not
So-
everyone wants to share their why, but
I would suggest, what I'll do is I'll do a roll call of all voting and non-voting members on our side. And then I'll ask 2 people to share their why. Does that work?
sounds good.
All right, so I'm just literally going down the order I see people. So Kathy,
So I'm not going to be a very good student here. I'm going to go off this a little bit. So the 3 things that are most important to me are the safety of the children in the school based on what is going on in our country these days. And you know what I'm talking about. Second, the overall sustainability of the school. And third, to provide the best learning environment, physical space we can for every type of child that will be there.
so weren't we supposed to pick of these?
I said I wasn't going to be a very good student.
I know.
So I went off this, so that's my answer. So sorry.
So Kale, you do,
You can fit probably one in integration, one in energy, and I don't know what safety, maybe wellness.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Denise, you're next. Roger, I see your hand, but I'm just gonna go in order here.
Energy, wellness, and economy.
Mark,
I have wellness, energy, and ecology.
Mark Purple,
Energy, integration, and equitable community.
Greg,
Wellness, energy, and integration.
Kathleen,
Sorry, wellness and integration, equitable community.
Andrew,
Economy, change, and energy.
Keith,
Energy, wellness, and change.
Becky,
Energy, wellness, and ecology.
Roger,
I'm so disappointed. Everyone came up with 3. And they weren't even required to pick their top 2, even though they could have added a 3rd. So I'm going with wellness and change.
and
And
I have
please-
wellness and energy.
I'm okay.
Did I miss anyone? Because I'm sure I did. All right. Do I have 2 volunteers that want to expand on theirs now? Or do I get to volunteer? All right, so I'm going to ask Mark Davis to expand on his.
Is it possible to add the slide where you had all the little explanations?
The bullets.
Yeah. Thank you. Yep, I can give some backup, and I was gonna ask this to be shown originally, and I said, no, I'll just kind of wing it. Overall, and I think your presentation pointed to it, is we no longer are just building a school building. There is a heck of a lot more into this building that the community needs to recognize and deal with. And just as a quick example, I'll take a look at the old, which was on the agenda at town meeting, the old Union.
South Union. South Union.
Yeah. If you look at that's an old school building. And there's a reason we don't build them that way anymore. And there's a reason a building like that has 0 use for a school building today. And I think there has to be some education on a lot of this stuff. So in picking these 10, what was going through my mind quickly is what's more important, working with the community to get this engaged or presenting them with a project and answering that engagement as we present it. Wellness was my top area, primarily because it directly affects our ability to educate within the school. And so much of the components that we're going to be looking at directly impact our kids, directly impact our quality of education and getting the best for our kids. So it was pretty obvious to me that that was a very important component. Energy plays a part because we have to balance what our needs are to make this school work and our footprint, our carbon footprint. And I think we need to directly make that connection. And as I said a long time ago, one of the things that I've always felt, and I have a little experience because I grew up with a father who was an assistant superintendent of a school system for many years and was on every single building committee in the 50s and 60s. And I go back to some of his conversations with me, and I can point to schools that he was responsible for all the way up from something easy to very complicated things. And I'm seeing a lot of these design elements as they developed over time. So it's a lot of it is on the energy side and the ecology side, and even schools in the 60s began to deal with those issues. But I think we just have to take it 18 steps further. Does that help?
Great. Thank you.
All right. Greg, I'm going to let you nominate a member of your school administration team to provide a response.
How about Kathleen? You're welcome, Kathleen.
Oh, I am not prepared. I'm sorry.
How about Becky? She's always prepared.
Well, it's my bedtime, so we'll see how I do.
Becky did not pick economy.
You know, I was going between economy and ecology, Kathy. They were very neck and neck for me. But I do think that with wellness over the past few years, I think that the quality of our air quality in our schools is so important. COVID definitely highlighted that. And then I also think we need to look at I also liked the food access. That was the other piece for me, making sure that our food services area is one where we have the ability to prepare healthy options. And then energy, I think energy feeds into the economy because the more energy efficient we are, I think that in the long term, we are going to be better off economically. And then lastly, I will admit ecology, I guess I was thinking more of like resources. So I may have a late change here because I was thinking, looking at some of the ways that we can utilize, as you mentioned, solar. We can look at different avenues for cost savings that are also environmentally friendly.
Great. Thank you. And I will say, none of these boxes stand alone. All of them influence each other. They are all affecting each other. And so not only will all of them show up, but also doing things in one box will also support other boxes. For instance, energy, you can reduce energy, reduce cost, and provide good indoor air quality, right? So those things are not mutually exclusive. They really benefit each other. And so I'll just say that. And then the last thing we're gonna do, oops. Hold on 1 second. I realized I took that slide out and now it's not in here. Hold on 1 second. The last thing, we're just gonna spend a couple minutes, and we already started to talk about this, which is what's the process? What are we gonna be doing in the next several months? Let me stop and reshare. So a big bulk of what we're going to do is to talk about energy, or to talk about HVAC systems. And part of that is also doing a net zero assessment. So what this means in the near term is that we're going to be asking for data collection, what's the existing energy use of the existing Neary building. We're going to be asking about potential schedules, like how do you want to use this building? How much is it going to be used during the school year, during the summers, things like that. And then a lot of engagement throughout this process. So tonight is really the start of that. And then as we move into the PSR phase, we'll be doing some surveys to collect what we'll call the owner's project requirements. That's getting a little bit more information about how you're going to operate this building. What's your existing facility staff look like? What might it look like in the future? Thinking about the HVAC system options. So we'll start to talk about those. We'll talk about potential for types of systems that might require more site area. And so we'll think about that with all the different design options we might be studying to know where those would go. If that was the system you decided to pick, making sure it could work with any of those options. And then as we move into, and we'll do estimating in that phase. And then in the schematic design phase, we'll look at specifically, we'll dive into 3 HVAC systems, do estimating for those systems, and do the life cycle cost assessment that I had talked about earlier. And then ultimately that leads to a final selection of what the HVAC system is that would go into your schematic budget. And that's really on the energy HVAC side. And there are other things that we'll be doing. We'll be, again, continuing engagement around all of the other components that are not specific to energy. We'll start to develop a lead checklist or a CHIPS checklist. And so we'll start to sort of see what are those components on a more fine-grained scale that might go into the project. And then the bulk of the work happens in schematic design and setting the water budget. The 2 items in pink are not, standard services, but again, through sort of the first couple of phases, we'll start to understand if you're really interested in water, that's something that we could do in schematic design. If you really want to dive really deep into embodied carbon, we can do more assessments, a life cycle assessment, not to be confused with life cycle cost assessment, but a life cycle assessment is what the assessment is that you do around embodied carbon. So there's things that can be added into that phase depending on goals of the projects that goals for the project that come out from these conversations.
Andrew, you have a question?
A little bit off topic, but kind of a random question is, as we go through this and we start to look at the design, say we talk about like a, geothermal well field, where this school is located, it's adjacent to another school. Is there any thought process in terms of if we're going to, build a well field to build one that could be utilized by our other school as well, or something similar in terms of some of these energy efficiencies? I don't know if there's any efficiencies in terms of also combining it with our other nearby school, but just a thought.
So yeah, that wouldn't be explicitly in There are assessment, that would have to be something that would have to come from the town if that was something you wanted to explore outside of this particular project. Just feasibility, yes, those kinds of well fields can be shared between buildings.
Kathy, then Mark.
Hey, can you go back to the previous slide, the first part of the slide? So if I came in and looked at this tonight and knew nothing, didn't have the matrix over my other screen that I do with the 12 choices on it, I would assume that we're building a whole new building, brand new building based on what we're seeing here. And I know that's not true, that one of the choices is to renovate. I assume that the repair is really not realistic. So let's assume it's either substantially renovate or build new. How does the not building new factor into this? In other words, you wouldn't do all this, I wouldn't think, if you were just going to renovate the current building. And then
So all of this is agnostic to whether it's new construction or renovation.
So you would do every
It's the same
renovation also?
Yes.
Okay. And then with Andrew's question, as far as trying to factor in Trotter or bring in Trotter as far as a geothermal well or whatever the well field is, which I understand geothermal, I don't know what a well field is, or whatever it is. You got 3 months to put all this together. How on earth are you going to have time to even factor something like that in, even if the town wanted you to do it? I don't see how you're going to get done what you're already supposed to get done. You guys seem to be very confident. I know this is what you do for a living, but boy, it seems like a lot has to be done between May and August to give us time to think about what you have put together and then vote on it. So I don't see how you go much further than this as far as our timeline in doing things like the creative thing Andrew just suggested. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, as you said, we do this all the time. It's pretty standard practice. So we're up for the challenge. It's good to have appreciation to know that it's not an easy job, but yes, we're used to it. And yep.
Right, Mark.
Yeah, taking Andrew's question one step further. There is and geothermal is one example. There's another example which is a septic versus having to put in a treatment plant. We as a community may have to look at on both of those issues. If it's geothermal, perhaps yes, there's the ability to bring in Trotter. And I take it one step further to get neighborhood approval of all of these projects. You work with the local utility, in this case, Eversource, to do a pilot and actually extend it to our neighborhoods, which abut the schools, to get their support into the project. There's some exciting things going on with geothermal. There's grant money available. There's a host of things we can be looking at. On the septic side, I think we're going to be staring at that issue. And that leads into, if we have to put a treatment plan in, adding Trotter to that to cut costs. And even beyond that, it directly impacts ideas of using gray water from that treatment plant to backfill our water needs in the buildings. And there are schools in the Commonwealth that do that already. They're designed to take the gray water from the septic treatment plants to utilize within the schools. So I mean, a lot of these basic decisions are going to impact whether or not we can expand in 3 or 4 different directions. So I kind of like what I heard, but a simple question as Andrew's could lead in 18 different directions.
That's my point.
I
May to
agree.
August, May to August. So Mark, what do you mean about the septic? You don't think we can put a septic system in for a big school?
I don't think we have the capacity there. That was the issue 25 years ago, that we couldn't expand it. We didn't have the capacity to meet Title V. And if we're looking at expanding that school to grades 3, 4, and 5, or 2, 3, 4,
2, 3, 4, 5, or double it.
we're way over the capacity of site, so we're looking at a treatment plant. And
So-
I'm not afraid of that. I think it's, in my own personal opinion, it's the way to do it. And we
So we're
would,
straying a little bit,
Yep.
right? So let's let the Arrow Street team come back to us
Sure.
on, like, once we start to understand various potential sizes, then they'll educate us on what's needed from a septic perspective.
Yeah, if I could just jump in for a second, Mark, if there were some studies done 25 years ago, if you can point us to them, we might as well start where they left off as opposed to start from zero.
well, I may have some of those in my attic, but I have no clue where they would be. But I wasn't on the Neary committee.
Well, nothing was done at Neary 20 years ago.
No,
other than
Oh,
having-
but we
Paul
did.
Pazinski has this information, so we can get it from him, our ex Board of Health inspector. He knows all about the Neary septic system.
Yeah, we did a feasibility study on all the schools 25 years ago, which included Neary.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm happy to pick up whatever information we can.
So Larry, we'll put you in contact with the Board of Health and see what they have in their files. Then we can reach back.
Okay.
if
Yeah, I
that-
mean, we
they don't
have
it.
had it on our agenda to go visit with them, so all much the better for getting started on that effort.
Okay. Denise?
So correct me if I'm wrong, but talking about overlapping services is a great idea, but don't we have to tread lightly because we can't use the allocated money for Neary for this project to any other school? Am I wrong about that? Under the SBA model?
That's correct. Yeah.
Well,
So
certainly
we-
not Trottier, certainly not Trottier.
Yeah, we are limited in the scope as to what was designed or what was
Right.
stated in the SOI. Yep.
So when we start talking about treatment facilities and including Trotter, wouldn't that be a problem with SBA?
It would, yes.
So we'd have
So
to
we
pay for it ourselves, Denise, totally out of
Yeah.
pocket.
Yep. I just wanted to remind everybody about that.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to obviously balance the team's time, right, as we move forward here. And they'll guide us, right, on what we can and can't do, and what the impact of some of those discussions may or may not be. Kate, so Mark and Denise, you're both good, right? I see your hands. are still up.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't put it down. I apologize.
Did I?
Kate, is there anything else from your side that you wanted to cover tonight?
Nope.
Okay. Are there any parting questions for the Arrow Street team?
I've got, okay, so I've got just one comment, just like I told you guys about the dog park took another step Saturday to get done. We also have a outdoor illumination bylaw that we passed in 2021 that you'll have to comply with. I saw, when you hear the dark skies up there, which made me think of that. So there is a bylaw that you'll need to comply with.
Okay. Thank you,
Sorry,
Kathy.
Kathy, what was that? The outdoor illumination?
Outdoor illumination bylaw, and we'll get it to you.
Oh, sorry, illumination.
Illumination,
Sorry,
lights, outdoor lights. We're trying to keep our skies dark.
sorry, I was thinking it was outdoor elimination, and I was
Sorry.
thinking, what the heck is that?
No,
Related to the dog park.
that's true. We could.
I had the same thought.
Sorry,
Larry.
It's the end of a long day.
Yeah. All right. Are there any public comment? All right. In terms of meeting schedule, I'll remind everyone we have our regular monthly meeting next Monday night. So a week from today, 7 p.m. via Zoom. And then the following week on Thursday, we have the in-person Zoom. In-person open forum. We are also going to look at post-April vacation doing a Zoom, but we will not advertise a date for that until we get through the in-person open forum. But we've already had requests for a Zoom for the open forum, so we're going to bifurcate it just due to audio issues. Questions on the meeting schedule? Is there any other business anyone wants to conduct tonight? All right, I will make a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second,
All right, I heard a second. Let's do a roll call. Kathy,
Aye.
Mark,
Aye.
Denise,
aye.
Roger,
Aye.
Andrew,
Aye.
and I am I as well. Did I get it? 06? All right, have a good evening. We'll see everyone next week.
Good night,
Thanks.
Good
everyone.
night. Thank
Great
you, everybody.
presentation.
Good night.